Thank you for joining us for the second of our alumni webinar series. I'm Dr. Andy Hill, Professor of Sport and Exercise Psychology and Head of Postgraduate Research at York St John University. Before I introduce today's speaker, there is a few housekeeping matters. We'll be hosting a Q&A at the end, so if participants please use the Q&A section to submit any questions during the talk, and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can at the end. There is also an auto transcript appearing during the talk for increased accessibility. However, please be aware that it may not translate perfectly. A video recording of the talk will also be made available and a link circulated. Thank you. So swiftly moving on to the main reason why we're here today, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Tracy Ray. Graduating in 2001 from York St John University in Physical Education and Psychology, Dr. Tracy Ray became the president of the Students' Union in 2002 before continuing her educational journey. First completing an MSc at Loughborough University in Sport and Exercise Psychology, and then a PhD at the University of Stirling, proposing and testing a new talent transfer lifecycle model in sport. Alongside her academic journey, she has enjoyed a diverse career. From being the director of Scottish Gymnastics in the lead up to the 2014 Glasgow Commonwealth Games, Tracy secured a role with Lloyds Banking Group before moving into construction, applying her PhD theory about the validity and utility of transferable skills from sport with great success. Tracy has recently become the chair of Parkour UK and is a freelance consultant. Testament to her skills, her roles within these different industries have varied. Tracy has recently finished 2 years as the European Head of Human Capital at Lang O'Rourke within construction. Previously, she worked as Head of the Business Operations and then Product Owner for Colleague Development at Lloyds Banking Group. Dr. Tracy Ray will be talking about how she swapped elite sport for banking and banking for construction, highlighting the value and importance of transferable skills. We'd like to welcome Tracy back and look forward to hearing advice for our student and alumni community, and also hopefully hear about the experiences that makes Tracy's story so interesting and impressive. So without any further delay, I shall hand over to Tracy.
Thank you very much, Andy, and what a warm welcome, and appreciating that I've come back to York St John in terms of presenting now. I appreciate the time to be able to do so. I think what's really important to be able to start with is sharing a little bit about me from an identity perspective. So rather than jumping straight into the career context, I am a single mother to a 9-year-old daughter called Georgie. And also my parents, who are both retired, live with me. And so that is our family dynamic. And that has enabled me to be able to continue to pursue my opportunities and the passions that are important to me, but so I couldn't do it without their help and support. So as I was growing up as a teenager in particular, I represented England at shot put. I was a regional hockey and netball player and got involved in every sport going, basically. So when going to York St John, the opportunity of all the sports clubs was fantastic. And by the end, I think I played netball, hockey, athletics, gone on women's football tour, did a bit of rugby, everything that I could to enjoy. So the whole experience for me was not only the academic side, which was fantastic because of the lecturers that we were exposed to and their expertise and professionalism, but the holistic side. And obviously you'll appreciate as current students, the idea of moving away from home and having to fend for yourself. And I was extremely naive back then, didn't know half the stuff that I should have done in preparation for being independent. It was a great learning curve, if not fast-tracked in every single way. So through those years, one of the things that stands out for me is the connection I made with some of the really special people that I met and the friendships that I made, not only in terms of my peers who I'm still friends with, 25 odd years later, but the fact that I am godparent to their children and the fact that we still meet up on a regular basis is one aspect of it. But another aspect is the lecturers and the wider circulus of friends that you make. So there was a particular gentleman called Richard Mallows who I was very interactive with and got on well with, connected with, which was fantastic. And another gentleman called Tony Gummerson, who was my athletics coach for a while. And those people and their legacies stay with you for the right reasons. They shape who you are as an individual. And as you can appreciate from the teachers that you had at primary or secondary schools, that still carries on in a continuous journey through your university years, and potentially people that you may stay in contact with. But one person in particular who unfortunately has passed now is a gentleman called John Moore, and he was part of the alumni, and not only was a lecturer and part of the university setup in so many ways, but he was a huge personality and a significant positive force on driving everything to do with the university. So John Moore and I were friends for years afterwards, and whilst I was president of the Students' Union in my 4th sabbatical year, I managed to have a discussion with Professor Diana Wilcox, who was the Vice Chancellor at the time, in which to put forward an application for him to receive an honorary degree from the university for all his work and his passion and dedication to the university. And that was realized, and probably one of the top 5 experiences of my life was being able to not only write the speech for John to receive that honorary degree, but also being able to present it in York Minster, which was phenomenal. I mean, you can imagine getting up, not only talking in front of all those people, but within that environment was hugely special and exceptionally memorable. So John Moore, another fantastic person who I met through York St. John and who left such a huge and indelible mark on me. But as I just stated there, I stayed in terms of being president of the Students' Union, and that was a huge learning curve in itself, and something I would advocate for people to do in terms of getting involved in the wider university and everything that it offers. It certainly gave me, huge life skills and preparation for going into employment, and that was the good as well as the bad. And certainly having to suddenly go from a university environment and enjoying yourselves as a student, even though you were working hard for, modules and exams, etc., but to suddenly being up in the grown-up world of having to sit at a table in terms of board meetings, etc., was a very different view of the world, and one I appreciated, especially when I stepped through my years in terms of career history. So after my year of being president, I then left, and as Andy had shared, I went to Loughborough University and studied a master's in sport and exercise psychology, which was always an aspiration for me to continue to work within sport, as that was a passion and that was part of my identity growing up with all the sport that I partook in when I was younger. But I was particularly interested in psychology, mainly because the fascination for me, how in my competitive years as an athlete, I couldn't understand how one week I could be on top of the world and, training and competing exceptionally well, and the next week not doing so well, and the lack of confidence associated with that, and how I would be able to control and manage my own emotions and feelings. So a great opportunity to be able to specialize further and continue my educational career, which I'm a huge advocate for, and certainly I would encourage people to explore how they could continue after the university years with their education and a lifelong journey of continuous learning. But within that master's year, something really important worth sharing is that I volunteered for everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. So if there was an opportunity of getting involved in a local sports football team and acting as a sports psychologist in that context, I took it. I started in that same year to work towards my level 3 netball coaching qualification. And so I took a number of hours volunteering in that way. I also was looking at BASIS accreditation at that time, and therefore went and took part in any of the courses that were available to students and or wider than that. And I remember, traveling all the way up to Glasgow for a course just for a day because Professor Stuart Biddle was there. And he was someone I wanted to meet, and I wanted to be able to attend the course as well. So volunteering in terms of being able to get wider exposure to the environment that you're looking to move into and to be able to build your networks is hugely valuable and something I would encourage everybody to do. And with that as well, I think that there's a second aspect to be able to tease out a little bit further in terms of advice I would potentially give anybody looking to, pursue a particular career, regardless if that's sport or any other context, is the networking aspect. And the more that you can build your network and build on, other people's expertise and be able to learn from that and nurture those relationships is hugely valuable. So I would encourage you, regardless if you struggle with confidence and or wondering how you can get in with people, remember they're only human beings. They can only say no to you, but if you don't reach out, you'll never know. So for me, as you can imagine, I don't have an issue with confidence, but at the same time, I would reach out to everybody and strike up conversations and explore further as to how they got into the career that they did and what advice that they would give me so that I would start building this portfolio of knowledge of all the things that were out there, or whether they would consider me in the future for being able to recommend me for opportunities or even just signpost opportunities that were coming. So 2 aspects to take there: volunteering and getting involved in wider opportunities, and secondly, with regards to networking and nurturing those relationships, especially as you get older and continue to be able to explore what excites you and what you're interested in. So after my master's, I decided that I would accept a role working part-time as a lecturer in Loughborough, and so stayed there for 4 or 5 years. But at the same time, I wasn't just lecturing. I continued with the volunteering. I continued in terms of working with a number of groups in terms of sports psychology. So I worked with everybody from the Women's Football Academy that was based at Loughborough University. I volunteered in terms of working with the Women's England Rugby Academy squad as well, and I toured to Ireland with them. So continuing to build on the knowledge, but also gain experience at the same time. And also then I was asked to be the national coach for the British Colleges squad, and we toured to New Zealand. So again, starting to build out not only, my career and what I wanted to look at in terms of, future professional qualifications and opportunities, but at the same time, how I could get involved in wider opportunities that would start building my portfolio of work. I then moved on to the University of Bath, where I became a teaching and coaching fellow. So it allowed me to combine the lecturing side, which I absolutely loved, as well as then the coaching element of netball. And there was a lady at the time called Lynn Gunson, who was from New Zealand, who was very forward thinking in her netball coaching, and that's why I moved there. I wanted to be able to surround myself with the best people and learn from them, and humility and understanding where your growth areas are and what your areas of development that need to be continuously evolved and nurtured. I think that humility and understanding of yourself is important as you move forward in the formative years of your career. But I was there for a couple of years, and understanding that I wanted to be able to gain some direct experience of working in high performance sport, I moved up to Scotland and worked for the Institute of Sport. And don't get me wrong, this may sound like a linear path in terms of moving from A to B to C, but at the same time, I did apply for a number of roles within the English Institute of Sport. And I was lucky enough to be shortlisted for interview, but I never was successful in securing any one of those roles. So I decided to branch out and look at the Welsh and the Scotland Institute of Sport. And I was lucky enough to get a role as a lifestyle coordinator up in Scotland, which was fantastic because at that point, in 2009, London had already been awarded the Olympics, as well as then Scotland having been announced for the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. And again, I started looking at wider opportunities up in Scotland and how I was going to be able to look for the next 10 years about, what was it that really interested me and where did I want my career development to go. And so I was throwing my hat again in a number of opportunities and applying for different roles. And I'd noticed that there was one available with Scottish Gymnastics as the performance director. Now, this for me, in terms of lesson learned, and when I look back and reflect on it, was huge, because having gone or working currently within the Institute of Sport and putting myself forward as performance director, I had a number of doubts that were running through my mind as to whether I could do the role and or whether I was qualified and had enough experience. And I reached out to a number of my trusted networks and talk to them about what it was that was stopping me and why I had this almost like mental block in terms of putting myself forward. And I'm a massive believer in a saying called "feel the fear and do it anyway." And it's a book by Susan Jeffers. If people haven't read it, and I would definitely advocate it, is that I thought to myself, I have nothing to lose. They have already, and I'm talking about Scottish Gymnastics here, gone through one round of interviews, and the person that they offered it to had accepted another role. So they were going through to second interviews. And I thought to myself, well, they're not going to want to go to third. So they're not wanting those same people that they had already interviewed back. So I've got nothing to lose here. And by Jove, was I surprised when they offered it to me. And it was amazing. It was a hugely challenging role, to the point where there were significant challenges that I knew of before I entered into the role, and that I still chose to accept it. And then I didn't realize the magnitude of how big those problems were. But ultimately, my remit within that time period was to simply get X amount of medals that was assigned to us by Sport Scotland. Now, that was 3 medals of any colour, but appreciating that your next 4-year funding cycle is impacted unless you are able to secure those medals, there's a huge weight of responsibility that comes on your shoulders. And bearing in mind, I was, I think, 33, 34 at the time, so a huge learning curve in which to step up into. And it was all a bit of a shock to me when I found out I was pregnant and I just started the role. So as you can imagine, I had a lot of thoughts going through my head as to whether I should withdraw, whether I should, step down from the role. And I decided not to. I decided that I would take a small amount of time off and then get straight back into it, because I felt as though this was an opportunity that was not going to come around again. And I wanted the opportunity desperately. So luckily, in the lead up to the Commonwealth Games and the delivery of it, we did manage to secure 5 medals instead of the 3, which was fantastic. But I had already made up my mind during that time that I would leave Scottish Gymnastics after the Commonwealth Games. And the reason why was because at the same time as becoming pregnant, I also started a PhD. Now, believe me, starting a new role and doing a PhD and being pregnant was a lot to deal with, and something that I needed to manage very carefully, especially as I was a single parent and living up in Scotland on my own. But I was very passionate about this area of talent transfer and of athletes who had chosen that were probably out with their control for some people's reasons, to look at transferring to another sport, and the motivation and drive behind that, and their lived experiences as they were moving through the transition. So it would enable and help other athletes that were considering following a similar path. But I thought to myself, there's got to be something more in this. And I want to be able to prove this hypothesis myself of moving between industries and between roles. And that was another reason as to leaving Scottish Gymnastics and looking at the wider context of business. Now, I'm also, realistic in the fact, as a single mother, I needed to be earning more money. And you don't go into sport to be able to earn money. You go into it for the love of that industry and for the idea of potentially giving something back. but I needed to be able to look at the income as a single mother, and therefore decided that I would set up a limited company and that I would go back to my trusted network and see whom was willing to take a punt on me, if you want to be able to describe it like that, by me being able to bring to life the expertise and skills that I'd learned from high performance sport that would support and enable them within a business environment. And a great opportunity became available, not as a full-time role, not as a permanent role. I'd gone through my limited company, but as a contractor that would come in and support several different teams within Capita to be able to develop, their values, their behaviors, working on team building, and a whole plethora of areas that I knew that I could easily draw upon from high performance. So I did several months at Capita, and again, a huge learning experience of being in a completely different industry within a business environment. And probably the biggest lesson learned and taken from there was the shock of not everybody being as motivated and as driven as athletes are. And, quite a few number of people didn't enjoy working and didn't enjoy the company that they worked for and didn't enjoy the environment that they worked in. So certainly steep learning curves on how to navigate personalities and or certain behaviors, especially if they're not all working towards one very clear and outwardly facing goal, like an Olympics or a major competition, and having to understand how I could tap into their inner capabilities and talk to them on a personal and holistic level that would enable them to thrive, but ultimately for them to be able to understand the context of the expertise that I was bringing to the table. So during my time at Capita, I then got an introduction to Lloyds Banking Group. And that was as a direct result of a gentleman who had seen me present and had recommended me for an interview, because bearing in mind, you get these opportunities, but you still have to be able to prove your capability in front of the right people. And the exposure of being able to do that within Lloyds Banking Group was, again, something unexpected, but hugely rewarding. So I started as a contractor there, and I was coming in, as I thought, to do a similar role in terms of building high-performing teams and working with teams and individuals on values and behaviors, etc. But within the first couple of weeks, people started referring to me as the new hobo, and that stands for Head of Business Operations. And so I sat down with the gentleman who had interviewed and given me the role, one of the directors. And his rationale was, well, I wanted to be able to give you some breathing time of getting your legs under the table and seeing how you enjoyed the environment before telling you that this is your actual role and these are your responsibilities and this is what you've got to step up and deliver. Well, as you can imagine, that was a huge amount of pressure then put on me in a very different way. And I ended up immersing myself in the experience and in the environment for hours and hours every single day to understand what the full, end-to-end responsibilities of the role was and how I could deliver against that successfully. And having started in the January, I ended up having to deliver my first project by the October, a significant project that would impact a lot of people. And as a byproduct of doing that, they then offered me a permanent role, in which I took it. And I would say that that was one of my defining moments of success of how I would measure the transition of having moved from high performance sport into financial services. So I did the Head of Business Operations role for a couple of years and then moved into a different role, which was 18,000 people coming across together across the bank from 3 different divisions to form one brand new division called Group Transformation. And this was about moving from typical waterfall project methodology to agile methodology. And going on a huge learning curve again with everybody else on not only learning this technique, but being able to study and take qualifications as a product owner and within Scaled Agile, and being able to talk about it and to it. So a huge range of additional skills, and what I would describe now as, you know, continuous evolution of my portfolio of skills, and continuing to build on that, which I think is important, because if you're looking at career development as a whole, and you're looking about what you potentially bring to an organization, there is the T element in terms of, you know, having your specialisms, but having wider experiences and being able to cross-fertilize those ideas across roles, across teams, across industries has worked significantly for me, and been hugely beneficial in terms of the ideas that I can bring to the table and help expand and develop that organization. So it was at Lloyds Banking Group when I not only finished my PhD, which was 7 years in the making. So as you can appreciate, you know, working and being a single mother at the same time was definitely a challenge in terms of the balancing act. But I also threw my hat in the ring for a program that I had previously seen advertised, which was by Santander. It was a sponsored women's program for an all expenses paid trip to UCLA, which is, University of California in Los Angeles. And it was to train women to be board leaders of the future, board directors. Now, what's interesting about this is that I not only applied when I worked within the sport environment and was rejected, I basically did a bit of a micro experiment and used practically the same application, but within the business context, and now being able to talk to it from a Lloyds Banking Group and a financial services perspective, and I was accepted on the program. I find that an interesting dichotomy, but one experience which completely shaped the route that I took as an individual within my later career, and how it benefited me in terms of skill set. So there were 44 women chosen from all over the world, and there were 6 from the UK. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't a jolly. It was, you were up at 6:30 in the morning, and you were in classes by 7:15, and you were, studying into the night, and or you were having lectures or guest speakers, etc. So it was a full-on week, but certainly developed our skills in a safe but under a strictly pressurized situation to be able to cope with the reality of being able to sit on a board. And then I applied for my first board role, which is with CIMSPA. And CIMSPA is the Chartered Institute for the Management of Sport and Physical Activity. Now, I have already done one tenure on CIMSPA, so that's a 3-year term, and I was asked to stay on by the chair of the board, by Mark Woods. You might know him. He is a para-Olympic athlete and has been on the BBC at a number of Olympics in terms of presenting. And it was a great opportunity to be able to stay on for another 3 years, and I'm just in the first of that 3-year term. So doing 2 terms, and then you will leave the organization, but a great opportunity to start looking at the strategy of an organization and giving robust and objective challenge to the executive is the role of the board, and certainly one that has given me a fantastic learning experience. So I then, having left Lloyds Banking Group, was about to take some time out to write a book and be able to help other people go on their journey of either making their own transition and moving between industries and roles, and or help other organizations to be able to look at talent differently, and how you're able to build the blend, that diversity, that real good mix of individuals with different skill sets that helps create that high performing team. And so I didn't get very far in terms of that time out. I think I took 3 weeks out, and I was given the introduction to construction and to a gentleman called Ray O'Rourke, who owns Lang O'Rourke. And basically he said to me in our conversation that I'm too young, I've got nothing to write about in terms of life experience, and I should come work for him instead. Well, with that sell, how could I say no? And so my rationale there was for it to give me, a second opportunity of proving this hypothesis of moving between industries. And having just spent 2 years there, and especially through the pandemic and all the challenges that were associated with that, because you have to appreciate construction carried on. And not only that, but Laing O'Rourke were building 4 out of the 5 main hospitals across the UK. We were asked to not only carry on, but to hurry up and release some of the beds in particular. So it was definitely a challenging time for us to be able to manage and navigate through the difficult period, and that's still an ongoing exercise. And the last thing I'm going to share with you then is I decided over the past several months that I would look for my first chair of the board role. And as Andy had very kindly shared at the start, I'm now chair of the board for Parkour. Again, feeling that fear and doing it anyway, I threw my hat in the ring. I decided to put in an application and went for the interview, and had done my homework, and I had shown my passion and interest. And certainly with the experience that I'd received from CIMSPA and the training that I'd gone on, which if anybody wants to know further about that, then please reach out and I'll have the conversation. But certainly put me in good stead for the role of chair. And it's something I've been doing since September, and a huge learning curve in a very different way, as it's a different skill set that's required. So I wanted to be able to share that as a context, and appreciating that's been over half an hour already, just in the evolution of my journey and where I've been and where I've got to. As Andy said, I am a freelancer now. I have got other opportunities that I'm exploring in terms of part-time, full-time work. When opportunities come your way and conversations can be had, then there's no harm in exploring what they are, and you never know where they end up leading. But I think just to be able to reiterate some of the points that I've made so far is that throwing your hat in the ring and feeling that fear is definitely something I would encourage more of. As I say, people can only say no. And yes, if you are able to deal with rejection, because it will happen through everybody's lives, then it's something that you just need to continue doing until you find something that's right for you. The second thing is in terms of being able to build on your network and continue to draw upon them by nurturing the relationships and using them as sounding boards and asking for advice where appropriate. That's the important part. So I would encourage you, especially the graduates, as you start on your career journey, to look at how you can broaden your network and go and speak to other people within an organization who are out with your immediate team and or the wider function in which you work. Because if you leave a legacy and if you leave an impact on them, they will remember you and they will be willing to help in the future. So what I'll do is, rather than continue, and there were some questions, I think, from an alumni perspective, I will pause there before going to the questions and hand over to Andy and see if there's any questions available from the listeners, and I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I will continue with the questions.
Thank you, Tracy. We don't have any questions in the Q&A section, so if you'd like to just move on to the generic alumni questions that you've prepared, that'd be great.
Fabulous. Okay, so first question was, what's the single best piece of advice you have been given by somebody during your career journey? Well, I think I've touched upon those already, but one of the other things I would probably touch upon is about hard work. Nothing comes for free, and the dogged determination that's required to be able to succeed is required within everybody, because you look left, you look right in terms of being a graduate. And I used to say this when I was a lecturer, is that those same individuals are going to be applying for the roles that you are, and even more individuals across different universities. So you've got to be able to differentiate yourself, which means that you need to be able to look at those volunteering opportunities. You need to be able to look at how you can broaden that skill set and differentiate yourself from everybody else, which means hard work, which means a bit of grafting. So I think that the more that you can approach, a role with some due diligence and see where your skill sets lie, and be, opportunistic as to being able to look for those opportunities, and utilizing the network to enable that to happen, I think can only stand you in good stead. The other part of the advice I would just say is there are a number of times throughout my career where I have doubted myself. And whether you use the terminology of imposter syndrome, which I do find that with my friendship groups and my professional networks, that women tend to typically find this more frequently, I cannot recommend highly enough you being able to reach out to those trusted individuals and those closest friends to talk through those doubts, and for you to be able to kick in the rational side of your brain that enables you to think about things much more objectively. There are lots of situations, if I had more time, that I could share with you where I've done the wrong thing, or I've made the wrong decision, or I look back within hindsight, which is always easy, and say, I wish I'd have done that differently. But those are the things that shape you, and those are the things that you know that you will never do again. But a book that I would recommend, if you haven't heard of it, is The Chimp Paradox by Professor Steve Peters, in terms of managing your own emotions and your thought processes, especially when things do go wrong and or you don't understand why you're reacting the way that you do. And certainly Steve Peters has written a book for children as well, and it's something that I introduced to my daughter. So for any of you alumni or students that are listening that have children, or even I use it with my parents, then I recommend you using that book as well. The next question, which was, what was the most relevant module stroke course you did at York St John that helped you develop your skills? I do laugh at myself when I reflect back on this, but I would say that in the first year when I completed the basics in computer skills, that was probably the most beneficial course I ever did. And funnily enough, it was with Mr. Richard Mallows. So I didn't know anything about computers when I went to university, didn't really understand them, didn't take the time to be able to, utilize them as much as I should beforehand. So having that grounding was hugely beneficial. And I think that with the PE and psychology modules, I typically tended to take modules that didn't have exams because I wasn't very good at them. So I would take more of the outward bound modules, or ones that were predominantly based in assignments. So everything helped build in terms of my knowledge and my capability, but certainly probably the most relevant was the computer skills. Now, one of the things I will also share with you is that within my first year at university, I failed a module within my first year. Now, I thought it was the end of the world, even though it was biomechanics. So sorry to anybody that's listening that has that background or is a teacher within that area. But for me, that is not my forte, and certainly something I didn't enjoy. But there was a mandatory set of modules in the first year that you had to complete, and that was one of them. So for me, when I was given the opportunity of resitting it, or carrying over a fail in terms of my academic transcript into my second year, I took to carry it because I didn't want to fail again. And certainly it was something that I knew that I wasn't going to take forward with me in terms of my professional career. So I failed, I learned from it, I move on, but I didn't dwell on it too much, in the respect of knowing that there was a choice that I made, and it was something that I was happy for it to sit with, and not to spend too much time worrying about. One thing I would say in terms of my favorite memory of York St John University. Now, I've already shared with you about John Moore and the opportunity of being able to present to Diana Wilcox in terms of the argument of him receiving an honorary degree, but being able to then watch him being able to receive an MBE from the Queen as a result was even more fabulous. So not only that, and obviously the friendship groups that I made, but I think that the whole community environment of York St John and the legacy and the impact it left on me in terms of how safe I felt, how warmly I story tell about my time within the university, and the opportunities that I get to go back whenever I can, that draws me back to that environment, is something that really can't be described, but is felt. And certainly we try and go back every other year as a friendship group. So I would say that the overall experience of having chosen York St John, and bearing in mind I went there when I was in my A-levels to go and visit a lot of the universities up in the north, northeast, northwest, it was one that stood out for me regarding the community aspect. So something that I would say is more of a felt memory than something that can be tangibly described. But I would recommend my daughter going there, put it that way. I was asked a question in terms of, is there a particular piece of software or tool that you use now that you would recommend using to develop skills? And I'm not sure that there would be software or tools because I'm not in the same industry, and I potentially haven't carried forward the same skills. I've continued to develop that portfolio of skills that I've talked about. But what I would argue instead is the proactivity of continuous learning. Is that one of the biggest skills that I look for within people that I'm hiring now is their ability to adapt, so their adaptability skills, but also their resilience and their mental toughness. So if a new software or tool was presented to me, I would probably react like most people and say, oh, I haven't got the time, or I don't want to, etc. But with the way that technology is evolving, we're all on that journey together, and the ability to adapt and be able to embrace new ways of working and different types of learning, and proactively ensuring that you're on that journey makes all the difference in terms of how a colleague is perceived and how they are able to succeed over others who potentially just get mind block when those things come their way. So I would encourage you to be proactive with learning new skills and going on a continuous learning journey. And I love learning, so it's not necessarily an issue for me, but I do appreciate those people that potentially struggle with it. So it's what can you do with the different modes of learning that are available now that enables you to get some form of exposure, even if that's podcasts whilst you're out walking, for example. And the last one, so what did I do wrong along the way that I learned from? There are lots of things that I learned from in terms of that went wrong. But one of the things that I would share with you, and that will leave as a parting sentiment in terms of this overall journey, is that you need to understand who you are as an individual and what your values are. What is important to you? And certainly that's not necessarily something that's covered in depth at universities, but that you potentially do either within an induction program or that you do within a development program when you're in an organization. And for me, the values of who I am and what I bring to the table and what makes me different to my neighbors to the left and the right is something that I need to be aware of and mindful of in terms of the impact that I have on other people. But ultimately, it stands me apart in terms of my branding. And it has certainly led to me being given other opportunities as a result of knowing who I am and knowing what energy I put out there in the world. And what I mean by that is, my top 3 values, first one being honesty. When I was younger, that potentially didn't come out in the right way and I was too forthright. So definitely a learning experience as you gain life experience. The second value is teamwork, very much about the team first rather than the individual. So I think from all my sporting days, that certainly stood me in good stead, but it's certainly that I feel very passionate about within a work environment, is that you are only as weak as you're only as strong, sorry, as the weakest team member. So ultimately, you've got to be able to bring as many people on that journey as possible. And that certainly is expected when you are a leader at executive level, to be able to help enable that as much as possible. And then my third value is freedom and independence. So for me, freedom to be able to make my own choices and it not being stipulated to me is important. And for me to be trusted in terms of the freedom of making the right decisions within the environment in which I work, for the organization in which I work for, and with the team that I work with. So parting sentence, here's some words in which other people have described me. So energetic, unique, driven, direct, enthusiastic, honest, confident, and passionate. And two words that have always stood with me that have been described is bonkers and Marmite. So on that note, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And just over to you, Andy, if there's any further questions.
Thank you, Tracy. We do actually have some questions through the Q&A function. So I'll just pick some out, mindful of time. So the first question is, what are the things that keep you motivated?
I would, my initial reaction, that would be my daughter, is providing an environment in which she can thrive is important to me. And I think, again, that comes back to me and my identity. But keeping me motivated is actually new opportunities, new experiences, new ways of learning, and continuously going on that journey. That means that I better myself, I better my understanding and my knowledge. So my motivation comes from the fact that, I want to be able to provide the best life I can for my daughter, which means that I need the best version of me. And so that's probably what motivates me the most.
And one final question. What is the impact that you want to have on the world?
Wow.
It's a big one.
That's amazing. Well done, whoever's come up with that question. The impact that I want to have on the world is that I have been fiercely passionate and supportive to anybody that I've come across in terms of friendship groups and networks that have asked for my help. So I'm a big believer in giving back and karma and energy coming back round and being kind to others. So I think that the more that people have helped me, the more that I've wanted to help other people. And it's a bit like the opportunity of being able to come present here, is that I'm a big passionate believer in giving back. So whether that's through talks like this or, being chair of the board for Parkour, which is not a paid role, it's a volunteering role. So I do that in my own time, is that's for me is the legacy that I want to be able to leave, is that I've done my best. I've lived my life to the fullest. I've given back and I've given, my passion and my energy to other people to help them on their journey.
Thank you, Tracy. So with that, I'll give you a final thanks for a talk that was interesting, reflective, and insightful. And I hope everyone enjoyed the talk as much as I did. And so we'll bring the session to a close. I'll just thank everyone for attending, and thank you once and one final time, Tracy. Thank you.